Appalachian fairy rings. The little people of the mountains, British settlers, brought fairy traditions to Appalachia, where genuine encounters with small beings created a living supernatural folklore. Long before the Appalachian Mountains became synonymous with American folklore, the region harbored a supernatural tradition that traveled across the Atlantic Ocean in the minds and memories of its earliest European settlers. The British and Scots-Irish families who carved homesteads from the dense mountain forests during the 18th century carried with them something more than tools and seed. They brought a living belief in fairy beings, small supernatural entities that inhabited specific landscape features and demanded careful respect from any human who crossed their paths. This was not children's fantasy or literary invention. The fairy tradition that took root in the Appalachian chain represented genuine folk belief, a working supernatural framework through which mountain communities understood certain inexplicable experiences and navigated potentially dangerous landscape features. When 20th century folklorists finally began systematic documentation of Appalachian oral tradition, they discovered not historical curiosity, but active belief, practiced protocols, and fresh accounts of encounters that continued to occur in living memory. Vance Randolph's extensive fieldwork in the Ozark region during the mid-20th century captured fairy tradition as a functional element of mountain culture. His informants did not speak of fairies as distant legend, but as present reality. They identified specific locations, particular hollow trees, distinctive rock formations, isolated spring sources, as fairy territory requiring behavioral caution. They described fairy rings, those perfect circles that appear in grass and meadow, as the dancing grounds of small supernatural beings. To step inside such a circle invited consequences ranging from disorientation to temporal displacement to outright abduction into the fairy realm. Leonard Roberts conducted parallel documentation in isolated Kentucky communities, working with informants whose families had maintained cultural continuity in remote hollows for generations. What Roberts discovered challenged simple assumptions about cultural transmission. His Kentucky informants described little people, small beings standing no higher than a child's waist, associated with specific natural features, capable of beneficial interaction but dangerous when disrespected or disturbed. The structural details of these accounts bore unmistakable parallels to Cherokee Inuit-Sunsti tradition, the indigenous belief in small supernatural beings that inhabited the same mountain regions. The parallel presents genuine mystery. Did British settlers adopt elements from Cherokee tradition through cultural contact? Did Cherokee and European traditions influence each other through decades of proximity? Or did both cultural groups independently develop similar belief systems in response to similar experiences in the same landscape? Roberts's documentation does not resolve this question, but it establishes the parallel as fact rather than speculation. Hubert Davis approached the question from the eastern side of the Appalachian chain, documenting fairy lore in Virginia and North Carolina's Blue Ridge communities. His informants, geographically separated from the Ozark and Kentucky sources by hundreds of miles, described belief patterns that matched the Western Appalachian documentation with remarkable consistency. The little people appeared again, small beings associated with specific locations, requiring respectful treatment, capable of harmful action when boundaries were violated. This geographic consistency across culturally distinct communities suggests something significant about the nature of Appalachian fairy tradition. The belief system was not simply transporting intact from British sources and preserved through isolation. It adapted to its new environment while retaining core structural elements. Mountain communities identified new fairy locations in American landscape features. They developed protocols specific to Appalachian ecology and seasonal patterns. The tradition lived and evolved rather than fossilized. The documented dangers of fairy interaction follow consistent patterns across the geographic range of Appalachian settlement. People ventured into the mountains, and found themselves unable to locate familiar paths home, wandering for hours or days in terrain they had known since childhood. The disorientation was not simple confusion, but profound spatial disturbance. Landmarks disappeared, distances stretched impossibly, and the mountain itself seemed to shift and rearrange. Children figured prominently in the danger accounts. Appalachian tradition warned of changeling substitution, the fairy practice of exchanging a human infant for a fairy child. The substituted child would appear wrong to its parents, different in temperament, strange in appearance, failing to thrive despite careful attention. The belief was not abstract superstition, but practical concern, and communities maintained specific protocols for identifying and addressing suspected changeling situations. Temporal anomaly represented perhaps the most disturbing documented danger. Individuals who entered fairy territory reported experiencing what seemed brief intervals, an hour, an afternoon, a single night, only to return home and discover that days, weeks, or even years had elapsed in the human world. This specific phenomenon appears consistently in British fairy tradition and in Appalachian accounts documented centuries later and thousands of miles distant from the original source material. The consistency suggests either remarkable cultural preservation or genuine experiential basis. Folk traditions typically evolve and diverge over time and distance. When specific details remain stable across generations and geography, the stability indicates either extraordinary cultural discipline or repeated experiences that reinforce the traditional framework. Appalachian communities developed practical protective measures against fairy harm. Iron appeared consistently as the most reliable defense. Iron objects carried on the person, iron nails driven into doorframes, iron tools left at thresholds. The protective use of iron against fairy beings appears in British tradition, in Celtic sources, and in Appalachian practice with identical application, despite the ocean crossing and mountain isolation. Avoidance represented the second major protective strategy. Community knowledge identified specific locations as fairy territory, particular groves, certain rock formations, specific spring sources, and established behavioral protocols for necessary interaction with these places. The protocols were practical rather than ritualistic. One did not linger at fairy locations. One avoided them entirely at dusk and dawn, the liminal times when the boundary between human and fairy realms wore thin. One maintained special caution on specific calendar dates associated with heightened fairy activity. These were not theoretical precautions passed down through rote tradition. They represented community-validated practices developed and refined through collective experience. When protective protocols appear consistently across separated communities, maintained by practical mountain people rather than occult practitioners, the protocols deserve serious consideration as genuine safety measures rather than superstitious fancy. The 20th century folklorists who documented Appalachian fairy tradition approached their subjects with academic training that emphasized cultural relativism and respect for informant perspective. Randolph, Roberts, and Davis collected accounts without imposing skeptical interpretation or filtering content through rationalist frameworks. Their documentation preserves the voices of informants who spoke of fairy encounters as genuine experiences rather than symbolic narratives or imaginative elaboration. This methodological respect produces documentation of significant value. The accounts capture not what folklorists expected to find, but what communities actually believed and practiced. The result is a record of living supernatural tradition, functional belief systems through which real people navigated real landscapes they understood to contain genuine supernatural presence. The parallel between transporting British fairy belief and indigenous Inuit-Sunsti tradition documented in the same geographic regions raises questions that extend beyond cultural history into more challenging territory. If two culturally distinct traditions describe similar beings in similar locations with similar behavioral patterns, the similarity suggests either remarkable coincidence, extensive cultural exchange, or the possibility that both traditions reference genuine encounters with similar phenomena. Modern documentation of Appalachian fairy lore continues, though the tradition faces pressure from cultural homogenization and population mobility. Remote communities that maintained cultural continuity for generations now experience rapid connection to broader American culture. The living tradition, documented by mid-20th century folklorists, exists now primarily in archival form, preserved in academic collections and regional historical societies. Yet accounts continue to emerge. Hikers report disorientation in familiar terrain. Children disappear briefly in circumstances that defy simple explanation. Witnesses describe small figures glimpsed at dusk near specific landscape features. Whether these contemporary accounts represent cultural persistence, genuine ongoing encounters, or the human tendency to interpret ambiguous experience through traditional frameworks remains open to interpretation. What the documentation establishes beyond dispute is the historical reality of Appalachian fairy tradition as living belief system. The geographic consistency of that tradition across separated communities and the structural parallels between European and indigenous small being traditions in the same mountain regions. These facts do not require supernatural explanation, but they resist simple dismissal as mere folklore or cultural artifact. The Appalachian Mountains continue to harbor places where cellular signals fade, where familiar paths become mysteriously difficult to follow, where the boundary between mapped territory and genuine wilderness remains surprisingly permeable. In such places, the old warnings about fairy rings and little people retain practical resonance regardless of one's position on supernatural reality. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.